Boston, the spring of 1884. The dress was the color of a deep, restless sea, blue, silk, and trimmed with lace that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. It was the sort of thing a young woman might run her fingers across and forget how to breathe. Louisa was 19, and she wanted it the moment she saw it. The shop was small, crowded, the kind of place where the air felt heavier. It was a secondhand store, and every inch of it had that smell. And if you're a thrifter like me, you know that smell. The smell of coats that had been lived in by previous owners, hats whose ribbons remember other hands. And in the back of the store hung a single wooden hook with a dress. The shopkeeper said it had only come in the day before, and it came from a fine family. A young woman much like Louisa herself. Couldn't say more than that, though, she said. But it's a lovely thing indeed, isn't it? For $3, less than half of what such a gown would cost, Louisa paid. She walked home in the May light with the dress folded in a brown paper against her chest. And she wore it that very Saturday at a dance held by one of her friends. She remembered it later, the way the silk moved, the way the candlelight caught the seams, and the way a young man whose name she would forget asked her to dance, and she just laughed. But then came the headaches, and then came the fever, and then the sores. Within a week, Louisa lay in a darkened room while the doctor in a black wool coat held a handkerchief over his mouth and spoke quietly to her mother in the hall. The shop where she had bought the dress was closed, quarantined. The shopkeeper, dead. 3 customers, dead. All from smallpox, the doctor had said. And the smallpox had a way of traveling on clothes, on lace, and on silk. Louisa did survive, but barely, and the dress had been burned in the yard. And her story was published a few weeks later in the Evening Post under the title Blue Silk. It was, in its most, a fiction, but a moral tale that demonstrated just how fragile life could be and how quickly something that seems so beautiful can be so deadly. Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, spooky souls, to our second remastered episode of Let's Talk Spooky. I cannot believe I have been doing this for a year, and to be able to go back and revisit episodes when I first started podcasting, it's an interesting experience. I have grown, I have become more confident, and I think that these episodes truly deserved a little bit more to them. So here I am, recreating and adding new stories. But if you're an original listener, don't worry, because this episode is going to be very different. It's going to have brand new aspects to it, brand new stories, and an even creepier vibe. So if you're ready, come along with me as we explore some creepy thrift stores and maybe pick up a haunted object or two. So light a candle, get cozy, and let's talk spooky. If you're like me and you absolutely love thrifting, then this is definitely going to be the episode for you. Because I don't know what it is about getting up and going to yard sales on a Saturday morning or finding an awesome antique piece at a thrift store that just, I don't know, brings life back into your day. But we've never actually thought when we buy these things, what they were used for before, who they were owned by, and whether or not that person is still here. Or maybe something else could be attached to these items. But before we get into thrifting, before we get into the haunted objects, I want to set the scene for you. It was the 19th century when secondhand items, for the first time in human history, became a problem. Before then, you didn't really throw things away. You didn't have the luxury of doing that. You wore those clothes until essentially you could no longer sew them, fix them, or make them fit on your body properly. A dress was a year's wages, and sometimes more. And if your silhouette changed, well, you had to make adjustments. And when it tore, you patched it up. If it grew too small, you passed it down. And when you wore it through, it became a quilt. And when that quilt fell apart, it became rags. So essentially, everything had a purpose, and nothing ever truly left the house. It just disappeared with time. But what if the quilt that became rags had a story attached to it? Well, there is one, and they're called the rag pickers. In London, in New York, in Manchester, in Paris, an entire underclass of human beings made their living in the gutters of the industrial city streets. Children mostly, widows, the desperate. They walked the streets before dawn, hooked sticks, burlap sacks, and they pulled up rags from anywhere they could find them. Refuge heaps, sewer systems, undersides of bridges, and even the pockets of corpse that they pulled out of the river. Journalist Henry Mayhew documented them in 1851 in a book called London Labor and London Poor. He described their hands as permanently stained and their clothes as a mosaic of other people's lives, their lungs ruined by the dust of fabrics that were 100 years old or more. And the rags they collected went to mill. They were respun, or to paper makers to become pulp. Or, and this is where things get kind of interesting, they went to the secondhand trade. Because in the middle of the 19th century, the demand for cheap clothing was enormous. And as the population grew, the poor needed something to wear. And so a strange new economy was born. One that cleaned, repaired, and resold the clothing of the dead. And the dead were everywhere. Smallpox killed in waves around the 1800s, and tuberculosis, also known as consumption of the time, took roughly 1 in 7 Americans. Scarlet fever swept through children's bedrooms like a tide. Cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, they all had a name and they all made their way through the cities every summer. But when someone dies of disease, the medical wisdom of that time said the clothing was suspect. Some doctors urged burning it. Many families, especially poor ones, could not afford to do that. And the clothing went back into circulation. Laced collars that had pressed against the throats of a tuberculosis girl in Brooklyn ended up on the market stalls in Lower Manhattan 3 weeks later. Mourning veils that hung over smallpox-blistered faces was washed in vinegar and resold to widows in Boston. And there were people, quietly, without much written about them, whose business was to strip the dead. Undertakers' assistants, if you would say, hospital workers, sometimes mourners, or attendants of funerals. The well-to-do were buried in fine clothing, and the poor, well, they claimed it. The clothing was valuable, and they weren't coming back for it after all. This was the world that Louisa's story came from. Not necessarily a story, but more a warning. A real, honest, well-founded fear that dressed up in a piece of magazine fiction so people would shudder and turn the page. But fear of disease is just the surface. Underneath it all, older than germs, older than medicine, there's something deeper. The belief that objects remember. And you'll hear it across cultures sometimes. An emotional residue, an object memory, imprinting, residual energy. The idea that something such as grief, terror, love, rage can soak into an object and stay there. That wood chairs from a man who sat dying, holding something that he loved as he feared the grip of death, would hold that feeling when you sat upon it. That the dress of a young woman wore the night she heard her brother had drowned is not just a dress anymore, but a representation of grief. In Japan, this idea had a name, sumukami. The word roughly translates to tool spirits, and the folklore around it stretches back to the 14th century, to a Buddhist text that suggests that any object that reaches 100 years old would receive a soul. Umbrellas, tea kettles, sandals, lanterns, they wake up and they become aware. And here's the unsettling part. They also remember how they were treated. Objects that were cared for become benevolent. Objects that were used badly, neglected, or thrown away the moment they were no longer useful, well, those objects become vengeful. And this folklore is full of things. Not just objects you would think of. No, there's things like broken sandals that scratch at doorways, mirrors that show the faces of the woman who broke them, lanterns that wait patiently for their owners to pass away and then steal their soul. In Jewish folklore, haunted objects have a different name, dybbuk. And if you are a fan of Ghost Adventures, you may have seen the Zach Bagans' dybbuk box at his haunted museum. And that is the very kind of object that we're talking about. The word comes from the Hebrew word dybbuk, which means to cling. And a dybbuk is a soul of someone who had died with unfinished business and couldn't essentially pass on to the next world. And so they attached themselves to the living. Most often, dybbuks attach themselves to a person, but in some cases, they can attach to a place or to an object, a box, a book, a piece of furniture, and there it waits for an opportunity to, I guess, complete its business. But across the world, the same idea repeats itself. In Romanian tradition, certain objects become spiritually unclean, and they can't be passed down without bringing misfortune to the family. In Appalachian folklore, the belief is that the thing that a dead person loved the most should be given away to a stranger, never kept, never inherited within the household, because the love itself can become a rope to the spirit world and can allow the spirits to come back. In the Highlands of Scotland, bedclothes of the dying were burned in the moors, not for hygiene, but to keep the spirits from following the wool back into the household. And then there's the Victorian world, which had a relationship with grief that was unlike anything we've ever seen. Mourning was an industry. And when Queen Victoria's husband Albert died in 1861, she wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years in total. And the entire English-speaking world followed her into a wardrobe of grief. Whole shops sold only mourning clothing, jewelry only in fossiled black wood, polished with a glassy sheen, and lockets, brooches, rings, all woven in pendants into forget-me-nots and indicated a braid pattern that resembled the bond between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And in some cases, these jewelry pieces were even made with the hair of the dead, a piece of a mom and a piece of their child, worn against the throat, pressed against the heart, and passed down for generations. And here's the part that might send a chill through you. Many of these pieces are still out there, and we might not even know what they're made of. Antique stores, estate sales, velvet-lined cases in the back of shops, a few feet from a postcard or a chipped saucer, and most people would never recognize them for what they were, because they look like ordinary brooches with strange dark patterns under the glass. But those patterns are hair, and the hair belonged to somebody, and somebody else has the buried partner to that piece. I have made it my mission, every antique store I go to look for one of these brooches. So if you are in an antique store and you find something, do send a picture our way, because we 100% love to see pieces of jewelry from the Victorian era. And if I find one, I will post it on our social media pages. So be sure to be following there. Something else that we don't often think about is when we look at thrift stores and we see all of the paintings. Now, for the most part, I'm not a painting person. I don't often buy art, but sometimes I'm intrigued about what I find, and I wonder how old it is, if it's famous, or where it hung prior to the thrift store experience it's having now. And I think that most people never think that their painting is going to be haunted. But there are 3 paintings out there that have a reputation. The first one is called The Hands Resist Him, and it was painted in 1972 by an artist named Bill Stoneham. The image is a boy about 5 years old standing behind a strange, wide-eyed doll. They're facing the viewer, and behind them is a glass door. And pressed against the inside of the door are palms outward, and there's dozens of them, maybe hundreds if you look really closely. And they're all child size. Stoneham said in an interview once that the painting is a self-portrait. The boy was him at 5 years of age, and the doll was meant to be a companion of sorts, a guide between the world of the living and that of the dead. And the hands are the lives that he could have lived, but didn't. They're other forms of self, if you would say, the unborn. And the painting first sold to actor John Marley. You would know him maybe as Jack Waltz, the Hollywood producer who wakes up next to the horse head in The Godfather. But Marley bought the painting and not long after died. The Los Angeles Times art critic who received it after, Henry Seals, also died. The gallery owner who then showed the work after, Charles Fingarden, died as well. A few short years after getting ownership of the painting. 3 deaths, 3 men who had handled the painting in some way, all within a relatively short window of time. Now, the painting then disappeared for a number of years, until a California couple found it stuffed behind a brewery in the garbage. In February of 2000, they brought it home and put it on eBay. They titled it as a haunted painting, and they wrote a long description claiming that the boy and the doll moved when no one was looking, that their daughter, who was 4 at the time, had told them that the children in the picture were fighting at night, and that the figures would step out of the painting and walk down their hallway. They included photographs that they had said were taken with motion-triggered cameras. 30,000 people viewed the listing in a matter of days, and the painting itself sold for $1,025 to a gallery owner named Kim Smith. in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It hangs there to this day at Perception Gallery, and Smith has said that on the record that some visitors leave the room nauseous when they view the painting. Some weep uncontrollably, and some refuse to enter the building at all. I have never seen the painting in person, but I want to one day. And if you have gone to that gallery and seen the painting, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Is it as creepy in person as it sounds? The second painting is much older and much stranger, and in some ways, a little bit more disturbing, because it didn't haunt one home. It haunted thousands. In the 1950s and 60s, an Italian artist working in Spain under the name Giovanni Bargonin said his real name was Bruno Amadeo, and he painted a series of images of weeping children, big-eyed boys and girls with single glistening tears running down their cheek. The originals were sold to tourists, but its popularity grew and prints were eventually made. Cheap mass production prints, tens of thousands of them, and they would be hung in a number of living rooms, pubs, cottages across the United Kingdom for decades. Then in September of 1985, a British tabloid, The Sun, ran a story about these paintings, and the headline was "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The story came from a firefighter in Yorkshire named Peter Hall, and he told the paper that he and his colleagues had attended a dozen fires, which the entire walls, furniture, and family photographs, and even bodies had been burned to nearly ash. But there, in the middle of the rubble, was the crying boy print, completely untouched. Sometimes it was face down on a carpet, sometimes it was laying among still blazing cinder, otherwise unmarked. Now, The Sun ran this, and they asked the readers to send in their paintings. Fearing that this curse may actually be true, bonfires were organized by small towns, and people wrote in by the thousands describing their own personal experiences of their crying boy image. Things like the crying boy in the kitchen the morning after a stove fire, smiling somehow. A crying boy pulled from the smoldering flames of a bedroom, cleaner than it had been when the flames started. There are explanations, though, to this story, and fairly reasonable ones. The prints were mounted in a kind of fire-resistant compound board. The string holding them up burnt first, so they would fall face down. Now, doing that, the image was protected because the flames essentially couldn't reach the image. Statistically, it makes sense, right? But that wouldn't account for if the painting landed face up. Why would it not burn then? And story after story would come in about this painting, and it would always be untouched by the flames. Before we go any further, I want to talk about the artist himself, because Amadeo never gave a clean description on who the boy was. There had been rumors that he had been an orphan from the streets of Madrid, and that he had found him there, voiceless among the rubble of war. And he painted him because in that moment the boy's sadness was so profound that he felt inspired. It is said that the boy's parents had died in a house fire, but here's where things get strange. Because there was a priest in the area at the time, and once Amadeo was done sketching, the priest who saw the image had said that he would not bless the painting, for the boy himself in the image had died in that fire. Now, whether he had painted a ghost or not is up for your debate. But regardless, the image was so profound that it began to show up years later in homes across the United Kingdom, hanging in doctors' offices, hanging in art galleries. It was everywhere. And in most accounts, each home that it had been hung in eventually had a fire. Now, how much of this is verified is up for debate. We only go by the accounts of the Sun as well as any firefighting accounts that had been placed in of that era. But the retellings of these stories are so profound and so similar that it really does leave to question, maybe there is truth to this, and maybe the image itself is cursed. If you have one of these images in your home, which you might, you never know, I won't tell you what to do with it. I won't tell you to get rid of it. I just want you to know that keep an eye on it and maybe send a picture to us. And if I ever find one in a thrift store, I probably won't pick it up. I'm not gonna lie. And finally, our last famous thrifted item is probably one you're very familiar with. If you're a fan of Ghost Adventures and Zach Baggins, which if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you are, there is a particular box that he has in his museum that has a bit of a history. In 2001, an antique dealer named Kevin Mannis attended an estate sale in Portland, Oregon. And the estate, by all accounts, was normal. All except it was the items that had belonged to a Holocaust survivor, a woman who had escaped Poland and lived quietly in the Americas for the rest of her life. Among her things was a small wooden wine box, a cabinet, you could say. And it was something that the family was deeply afraid of. They had told Mannis that the cabinet contained a Dybbuk, and that they begged him not to open it. The woman kept it locked away for decades, and under no circumstance was anybody allowed to touch it. But of course, with a few dollars and a little bit of persuasion, Mannis brought it home. He took it back to his shop, he left it in the basement, and that night, according to him, he received a phone call from his employee screaming and asking who was in the shop with the lights on, smashing things and breaking glass. And Mannis didn't have an answer. He went down, he checked, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As the days went on, he started to have dreams, always the same one, with an old woman with hollow eyes stepping towards him in the darkness. He said the basement began to smell something like jasmine, and sometimes cat urine, and sometimes a blend of both. He would see the lights flicker all the time, and after a while of having the box, he decided to gift it. So he gifted it to his mother, of all people, which I don't know. And after being gifted the box, she suffered a stroke that very same day and begged him to take it back. He did, and within the day listed it on eBay. He sold it to a college student in Missouri who wrote that he began pulling out his hair by clumps just days after having the box. The box was sold again to a museum curator named James Haxton, who later wrote a book about his experience with the box and says that he was commissioned in the end to participate in a ritual to seal whatever was in the box for good. Now, the box has allegedly been sealed, and now this particular box is not the one Zach Baggins has. It's just a similar type. Dybbuk boxes were a very common thing, and their reputation, depending on the entity within, varied. But this particular box was allegedly sealed and buried somewhere that only a handful of people know. And believe it or not, the stories that came from this box was the inspiration for the 2012 film, The Possession. You may have seen it. And marketing leaned into the story that Mannis had stuck with the 20 years since he'd owned the box. Skeptics do pick it apart, and some argue the whole story was a bunch of viral fiction, but I'll let you believe what you want. And if you ever find yourself in an estate sale, and there's a tiny little brown box, maybe don't buy it, just in case it holds something that you really don't want to bring home. I do have one more story for you guys. This one didn't come from a paper or a museum. It came from a woman who had posted on Reddit anonymously a few years back. And it's a thread asking people about their experience with haunted thrift items. Now, she said she bought a chair. It was a vintage one. She described it with wooden claw feet, upholstered in green velvet. Some areas of the chair had faded to gray. The price was $12, and she brought it home and put it in the corner of her bedroom. That night, she had her first dream. She was standing in the bedroom, looking at herself sleeping in the dark. And there was a man there. She didn't know the man, but he stood beside the chair, and he also watched her sleep. The dream came again and again and again. It was always the same man, standing in the same spot, watching her sleep. She started leaving the lights on, but the dreams kept coming. She started sleeping in the living room, but the dreams followed her. 6 weeks later, she loaded the chair back into her car and drove it back to the thrift store where she had bought it from. She dropped it on the curb in front of the donation doors and drove away without ever looking back. She wrote that sometimes she wonders who took it next and whether they're sleeping well. So, if you've ever seen a green velvet chair with clawed feet at a secondhand shop somewhere, maybe hesitate about picking it up. Because you never know who might be watching you sleep. Now, before we end tonight's episode, I just want to state that I love thrifting, and I want to be clear on that. This episode is not to hate on thrifting. It's not to suggest that you're going to bring home monsters and demons every item that you thrift at the thrift store, because there's just something about the hunt and the smell of old books and the strange relationship that you feel with the items that you find in thrift stores. I have tons that maybe I'll give a tour one day on my socials, but I have a Raggedy Ann doll. I have just a number of creepy, cool things that I have collected over the years, as well as a number of furniture and very everyday accessories of life that I fill my home with. Because there's just something incredibly exciting and beautiful about helping give things a second life. And I just hate the idea of throwing away something that was loved once. In a world that is drowning in cheaply made stuff, don't forget to check your local thrift store. Because the things in there have bones, they have history, they have quality that this world has forgotten. And they can make a real beautiful impact on your life. Just make sure that if you have dark dreams after, that it maybe doesn't stay in your house for too long. So I'll leave you at that. And I hope that if you find something awesome at a thrift store, that you share it with those around you. And if you find something haunted, well, maybe make friends with the ghost? Depends on the piece, I guess. Thanks for listening to tonight's episode, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Take a moment to hit that follow button so that you never miss a future episode. We do these remastered episodes every other week, and I'm going to bring you haunted Victorian images next time. So as always, I look forward to scaring you in the next episode. Stay curious, stay spooky, and happy thrifting.